Hello! Welcome to GDW Tutorial 7. This will be part 2 of our Unity 2D Physics. Today we'll be covering collision. We'll be learning how to add colliders onto game objects, how to make triggers using colliders, how to edit and use the physics layering system to personalize the collision interactions between objects. We will also be diving into some collider-based functions in our scripts to allow us to code the different interactions when different objects collide with each other. You can find the details about the submission for this tutorial in the recap section. Anyways, let's get into some collision. Alright, so let's get started right away and hop into our Unity project from last week. Okay, so here we are, and just to show what we did last week again, if we click play, the car can turn and drive forward and backward, and that's pretty much what we did. We made the car move. So now let's add some colliders. So if we exit play mode, the first thing we need to do is add a collider onto our car, because if other objects have colliders but our car has no collider, then our car can't collide with anything. It will just go through anything. So let's click on player car, scroll down to add component. We still have the rigid body on here, the movement script which we added last time. So let's add, and we're just going to search collider. And as you can see, there's a whole bunch of different colliders you can add onto different objects. For us, since our car is the shape of a square or a rectangle, we only need the box collider 2D. Make sure you click the 2D one and not the regular box collider, as the regular one is for 3D and it will not work the same. So we want box collider 2D, and then it'll add it onto our car for us. And as you can see, if we zoom in, there's a green rectangle around our car, and that is the collider. So the different things in the collider, there's an edit collider part. If you click on this little button, it actually allows you to edit the size of the collider. So if you wanted the collider to be bigger than the car, then you could do that. Obviously we don't want the collider to be bigger than the car, so we will not be doing that now. The material is a physics material, which is the same thing as the rigid body physics material. You can make it bouncy or slippery, things like that. Is trigger. If this is checked off, it will change the collider into a trigger instead of a collider, and we will get more into that later on in this tutorial. These other things we will not be needing. Used by effector, used by composite, and auto tiling we will not be using. Offset is just to change the offset of the collider. So if we set X to 5, it'll move the collider 5 away from the origin of the game object, which obviously again we don't want right now because we want the collider to be actually on the object. Same thing here with size. Instead of clicking this button and editing it yourself, you can set it to an exact specific size if you wanted to, and you can also add an edge radius. And the edge radius just makes the edge of the collider thicker. So if we made it 1, it makes this whole little area a collider instead of just the edge around the car. So that is everything you can do with colliders. So now we need an actual object to collide with. So let's do that. Let's go to the hierarchy, 2D object, sprites, and for now let's just add a square and call it barrier. And why don't we make it 20 long, and let's rotate it by 90, and let's change the color so we can actually see it. So let's make it brown, I guess, and let's set the position to 0, 0. And now, since this is on the same layer as the ground, sometimes when you click play, the barrier will actually render behind the ground because it's on the same order and layer. So we need to go to the sprite renderer component of the barrier and change the order and layer to 1, just like we did with the car last tutorial. So the car and barrier will always be rendered in front of the ground, and we will never have an invisible barrier in our game. So once we have this barrier, it obviously doesn't have a collider on it right away because we haven't added one yet. So as of right now, it won't do anything. So if we click play and drive into it, we'll just drive right through it because there's no collider on it. So if we exit play mode, go and make sure we are on our barrier, click add component, and we can add another box collider 2D onto it, and it will automatically take the shape and size of the square itself. So if we zoom in, you can see the green outline kind of. It's kind of blending in with the white, but it is there. And now, if we click play and drive our car into the barrier, we can't go through it because there is a collider. So perfect. Collision works. So now, let's get into the scripting and see what we can do with these colliders. So let's exit play mode and get into some scripts. Okay, so if we go into our scripts folder in the project window and we right click, create a C# script, and we can do CarCollision. Perfect. And now let's open it up. Wait for it to load. And once it does, we can start coding. Perfect. I'm zoomed in quite a bit, so let's zoom out a bit. And right off the bat, we're going to add a function for what to do when an object collides. So if we click enter, enter, go to the next line, and we're just going to type in OnCollision, all one word, and it will come up automatically. OnCollisionEnter2D. Again, make sure it's the 2D one, as we're working with Unity 2D, and the regular one will not work. So OnCollisionEnter2D, and it will automatically make the function in there. Again, we can get rid of the private keyword because we do not need it. It is useless. And, well, in this case, it's useless. It's not always useless. But the way C# works with Unity is if you don't write anything, it's the same thing as writing private. So there's no point in having the word private there in this instance. So OnCollisionEnter, this takes in one parameter, which is the object that you are colliding with, the collision itself, and you can do whatever you want whenever a collision happens. So obviously in a driving game, if you hit a wall, there's not really much that you would do, but just for the purposes of showing, let's make it so OnCollisionEnter, when the car collides with a wall, will make the car bounce off the wall in the opposite direction at twice the speed that it hit the wall. So to do that, we can get the rigid body component of the car in this one as well. So we can do rigid body 2D body like we did in the last tutorial, and body equals get component rigid body 2D, and then body accesses our rigid body on the car, and then OnCollisionEnter, when it collides, we can do body.velocity equals negative body.velocity multiplied by 2. So the F just means float here. So if you're multiplying, the velocities are in float values, so you want to multiply it by a float value. So the velocity times 2 and negative direction. So when it hits the wall, it will bounce off in the opposite direction at twice the speed. So let's test this out. Let's go to Unity, let it load, and then we're going to add the CarCollision script. We're going to click and drag onto our player car, and if we click on it, we now have the CarCollision script right here. Perfect. So let's click play. Let's turn towards the wall and back up a bit. If we drive, we should bounce off at twice the velocity. Oh, it did not work yet. And that's because we didn't choose a specific collision to collide with. So if we go into our barrier, and here it's untagged and the layer is default. So the first thing we can try is changing the tag. So if we click on tag, there's no tags for barrier or anything. So we can actually make our own tag by clicking add tag, click this little plus sign, and we can name it whatever we want. So we can tag it called barrier and save it. Click on barrier again, go to tag, and add the barrier tag to the barrier. So now that the barrier has a barrier tag, we can go back into here and we can make an if statement and say if the collision dot contacts at 0 dot tag. Oh, sorry, that wasn't right. Collision.gameObject.tag, that's my fault. And we can make sure, check if it's equal to a specific tag name. So if put quotes and do barrier and put this inside the if statement. So if the game object of the collision's tag is equal to barrier, then we will set the velocity to the negative velocity times 2. So this should work. If we go back, we can see that, make sure once it loads that the car has the CarCollision script, the barrier's tag is set to barrier, and when we jump into this, it should bounce us off, which it did. Perfect. And it bounces us off. Awesome. Obviously it's not perfect because I just set the velocity to negative velocity, so it's going to be doing some weird bounces, but it works. So that is how you use these functions as well. And there's also a few other functions that we can use. So let's get rid of the bounce. Let's just comment it out for now. And let's add a new function. Type in OnCollision again. And then there's an OnCollisionExit2D and OnCollisionStay2D. So the OnCollisionStay2D is called every frame that an object is colliding with another object. So it's like kind of like the get key from earlier from the input section in car movement. Get key, as long as a key is being pressed, it will call every single frame. OnCollisionEnter only calls once when you hit something the first time, and OnCollisionExit will call something once when you exit a collision. So let's try that. OnCollisionExit2D, and let's just do a debug message. So let's do debug.log, and we will do car has stopped hitting the barrier. And then again, we can get rid of this. You don't have to get rid of the private word, but I like to because I think it looks better. And perfect. So we have the debug log on the OnCollisionExit. And also let's just add the if statement from earlier. So if collision.gameObject.tag equals barrier, then we can set this debug message. Perfect. Now let's go back into Unity. Wait for it to load again. Click play. And let's open our console window so we can see what it's saying. So if we hit it, nothing's going to happen, but once we leave, it will say the car has stopped hitting the barrier. And then we go again, the car has stopped hitting the barrier. So that's essentially how these functions work. And just to show it off even better, I'm going to do this, copy paste, and we're going to do the car has hit the barrier. And we're going to also add the OnCollisionStay2D, and we're going to copy paste, and we're going to write the car is hitting the barrier. Perfect. So we go back to Unity, click play, and so nothing in the console right now. If we hit it and then leave and scroll, we can see right away the car hit the barrier, and then while the car was on the wall, every single frame the car is hitting the barrier, and then once it leaves, the car has stopped hitting the barrier. So perfect. That's how the OnCollision functions work. So next thing I want to show you is triggers. So the way triggers work is if we go here and we change this barrier collider and check off is trigger. If we click play now and run into it, it doesn't actually stop us from going through it anymore because it's no longer a collider, it's just a trigger now. And these console menu debug logs are not showing up anymore because technically it's not colliding with anything. So instead of these collision functions now, there's different functions for triggers, and that is on trigger, enter, exit, and stay. So if we do an OnCollisionEnter2D, again, always make sure you're doing the 2D one when we're working with Unity 2D. And this essentially works the same way. So if collision dot tag, the way the trigger works is it's a little different. The collision is a collision 2D and the trigger one is a collider 2D. So they are different things. I know it can get confusing, but a collision 2D is different from a collider 2D. They're two different objects completely. So if we do collision dot tag equals barrier, and another way you can do this is if you do collision dot compare tag and you do it this way, it's essentially the same thing as doing collision dot tag equals barrier. This is just another way of writing it. So we have if collision dot compare tag is barrier, and then let's just do another debug.log message and write trigger entered. Perfect. Let's go back into Unity and click play and drive into it. It goes through and trigger was entered. And again, if I go through, trigger is entered. So essentially, the reason we use triggers is if we want to activate a certain event or something happening when you hit something, but you don't actually want it to collide with anything, you make it a trigger. So for example, in our racing games, we'd want to make maybe a boost pad or something. Like Mario Kart, they have boost pads on the ground. So you don't want to actually collide with the boost pad and crash into it and stop moving. So you want to be able to go through the boost pad, but you want it to activate a certain thing once you hit the trigger. So that's what triggers are for instead of collisions. So they are two different things, but they're used very similarly. So the next thing I want to show you is the physics layering system. So if we click on an object, let's say we want to click on the barrier, up here there's a layer, and every object when you create it is layered on default, but there is a few already made Unity layers, such as UI and water. Obviously this barrier is not UI or water. So what we can do is we can actually edit the collision based on different layers, and we can stop collisions from happening between different layers. So if we add a layer, this will pop up and you can add up to 31 layers. And let's just add a new layer and we can call it, again, let's just call it barrier, the barrier layer. Click on barrier again, put the barrier layer on, and this car, let's make a layer for the car as well and just call it car. Obviously you don't need to make a new layer for every single object, but just to show you how the layers work, I will do it this way, car. So now the player car's layer is car and the barrier's layer is barrier. So I'm going to show you how to edit the interactions between layers and turn off collision between specific layers. So to be able to do that, you want to go up to the Edit tab, go down to Project Settings, click on the Physics 2D part, and scroll all the way down, and you'll see this little matrix, this little thing with a bunch of check marks is something you could call it. And you can see these new layers that I just added, car and barrier, are on both the top and the side. And these check marks basically indicate which layers collide with specific layers. So if I, for example, didn't want the car to collide with the barriers, I would turn off the car barrier check mark. And I would turn off, yeah, so there's the car barrier check mark. Awesome. So now that that is off, a car and the barrier should not collide with each other. So if we exit this out and make sure I turn the is trigger off, or it will stay as a trigger and not a collider. So now this barrier is a regular collider, but since I turned the interaction between car and barrier off, I'm going to go right through the barrier, and it's not even going to detect it in the functions in the code. It's just not going to collide in any way because I turned the layer interactions off. So if I go back, project settings, physics 2D, and turn that back on, and click play, and we go, and we're colliding again, and the functions are working perfectly. So that is essentially how you use the physics layering system, and just a good example for how you'd want to use it. If I go in my barrier and I hold Control and click D, it will copy the barrier. Let's just rotate this 0 and put it up here for now. If I don't want these two barriers to collide with each other, I can just go into Edit, Project Settings, same thing as before, and I can turn barrier off. So now these barriers will no longer collide with each other because obviously they don't need to collide with each other because they're just static, non-moving barriers. So that's a good way to use the physics layering system. And quickly before I end this tutorial, I just wanted to show you guys some other things you can do in these OnCollision or OnTrigger functions. So if I go in here and I type in collision, so this is the parameter, and I click dot, these are all of the different things you can access from this collision. So you can get the collider, you can get the amount of things that it's colliding with, you can get if it's enabled or not, you can get the game object itself. So if I wanted to edit the game object directly, I could. So if I want to do collision.gameObject, and then I can get anything from the game object itself as well. And anything that can be accessed in the game object can be accessed in this function. I can even just do a destroy, and I can do collision.gameObject, and if I collide with a barrier, for example, and click play, and turn it to a barrier, it'll just destroy the barrier. So you can do a lot of different things with the collision functions, and you can edit it pretty much exactly how you want and do exactly what you want when something starts colliding, is colliding, and stops colliding, and same thing with triggers. So that's the amazingness of the collision in Unity. It's very super easy to work with, it's very editable, it's very changeable, very customizable, and it's very easy to work with. So I really enjoy it very much. So that's everything I wanted to show you for this tutorial, and let's get into the recap section.